In the grim dawn of the 16th century, Europe was a place of shadows and whispers, where the slightest hint of defiance against the Church could mean a slow, agonizing death. It was a time when the light of human reason and curiosity flickered weakly in the face of religious dogma, and those who dared to question the status quo often found themselves at the mercy of the Inquisition, a relentless and terrifying force that roamed the continent, seeking out heretics and dissenters. One such figure was Bonaventure Desperiers, a man whose life and death serve as a stark reminder of the perils that awaited those who dared to think for themselves. Desperiers was a humanist, a scholar who sought to understand the world through the lens of classical knowledge and critical thinking. In a time when the Church held a stranglehold on intellectual life, this was a dangerous pursuit. Desperiers wrote a book called Symbolum Mundi, the world's symbol, a work that, in today's world, might have been nothing more than a minor curiosity, but in the 1500s it was a deadly weapon. Symbolum Mundi pointed out the contradictions in the Bible, criticized the persecution of heretics, and mocked the miracles that the Church held dear. In any other time, these ideas might have been ignored, but the world was changing. Martin Luther had just launched the Protestant Reformation, and the Catholic Church was on the defensive. The air was thick with suspicion and fear, and Desperiers' book was seen as a direct challenge to the authority of the Church. The Church, both Catholic and Protestant, was quick to react. The book was denounced, burned, and its author was hounded from pillar to post. Marguerite, the Queen of Navarre, a powerful and enlightened patron of the arts and sciences, tried to protect Desperiers, but even her influence could not save him. Banished from her court, Desperiers became a fugitive, always looking over his shoulder, always on the run. The stress and fear took their toll, and he eventually took his own life, a victim of the intolerance that had gripped Europe. But Desperiers was not alone. Étienne Dolet, another humanist, met an even more gruesome fate. Dolet was a printer and a scholar, known for his deep knowledge of Cicero and his willingness to publish books that were banned by the Church. This defiance of authority eventually caught up with him, and he was arrested and brought before the Inquisition. Despite Marguerite's attempts to intervene, Dolet was found guilty and sentenced to death. On August 3, 1546, he was burned alive in the place Maubert in Paris, a public spectacle that served as a warning to others who might dare to challenge the Church. The stories of Desperiers and Dolet are not just tales of individual tragedy. They are part of a larger narrative of human suffering and intellectual suppression that characterized the Reformation period. The Reformation, which began as a movement of reform within the Catholic Church, quickly evolved into a series of violent and often bloody conflicts between different religious factions. These conflicts were not just about theology. They were about power, control, and the fear of change. One of the most famous figures of the Reformation, Michael Servetus, was a Spanish theologian and physician who dared to question one of the core doctrines of Christianity, predestination. In his book, Christianismi Restitutio, The Restitution of Christianity, Servetus argued that God does not predestine souls to heaven or hell. Rather, individuals are responsible for their own fate. This was a radical idea, and it did not sit well with the religious authorities of the time. Servetus made the mistake of sending a copy of his book to John Calvin, the leader of the Protestant movement in Geneva. Calvin, who believed in predestination, was outraged. He arranged for Servetus to be ambushed and arrested. Despite his pleas for mercy, Servetus was burned at the stake, a slow and excruciating death that took over half an hour. The cruelty and intolerance that marked the Reformation were not limited to one side. The Catholics, who had long been the dominant religious force in Europe, were just as guilty of brutality as the Protestants. When the Swiss reformer Huldrych Zwingli was killed in battle, his body was mutilated and burned on a pyre of dried excrement, a barbaric act that reflected the depths of hatred and violence that characterized the era. But not all who suffered were leaders or famous scholars. Many ordinary people, caught up in the turmoil of the Reformation, faced similar fates. Ulrich von Hutten, a German humanist and knight, is a poignant example. Hutten was a brilliant satirist and a visionary who dreamed of a unified Germany. Like Martin Luther, he believed in the power of the German language and worked to shape it into the form we know today. But Hutton's enthusiasm often outstripped his judgment, and he made enemies on both sides of the religious divide. When he threw his support behind the failed revolt of Franz von Sickingen, he became a fugitive, reduced to robbing farms for food and hiding in the shadows. In his final years, Hutten turned to his former friend, the humanist Erasmus, for help. Erasmus, who valued moderation and tolerance, was offended by Hutton's fiery rhetoric and his attacks on the church. When Hutten, desperate and ill, begged for Erasmus' support, the latter refused, citing the lack of warmth in his home as an excuse. Rejected by his former mentor, Hutten descended into a spiral of anger and desperation. He wrote a scurrilous pamphlet about Erasmus and threatened to publish it unless he was paid. Erasmus, a man of principle, refused to be blackmailed, and Hutten was driven from city to city, a pariah and an outcast. In the summer of 1523, at the age of just 35, Hutten sought refuge on an island in Lake Zurich, where he died alone, impoverished and forgotten, his body ravaged by syphilis. His fate serves as a stark reminder of the personal toll that the Reformation took on those who dared to challenge the status quo. The Reformation, while a time of great change and progress, was also a time of great cruelty and suffering. The religious authorities, both Catholic and Protestant, were often more concerned with maintaining their power and influence than with the welfare of their followers. John Calvin, the leader of the Protestant movement in Geneva, is a prime example of this. Calvin's Geneva was a police state where the slightest deviation from his strict interpretation of Christianity could result in punishment, torture, or death. Calvin himself was a stern and unforgiving man, quick to anger and slow to show mercy. His regime was characterized by a level of repression that was unprecedented in Europe at the time. Calvin's rule in Geneva was a stark contrast to the more permissive and humanistic ideals of the Renaissance. While the Renaissance celebrated human curiosity and creativity, the Reformation often sought to suppress it. The Inquisition, a powerful and terrifying institution, was the enforcer of this repression, and its reach extended far beyond the borders of Geneva. In cities across Europe, people lived in fear of the Inquisition, knowing that a single word or action could lead to their arrest, torture, and execution. The Reformation, in many ways, was a tragedy. It promised a world of greater freedom and understanding, but it often delivered a world of fear and violence. The stories of Desperiers, Dolet, Servetus, and Hutten are a testament to the human cost of this tragedy. They remind us that the struggle for knowledge and freedom is often a dangerous one, and that those who dare to challenge the powerful and the orthodox must be prepared to face dire consequences. Today, as we look back on this period, we can see the seeds of the modern world in the intellectual and religious ferment of the Reformation. The Humanists, despite the risks they faced, laid the groundwork for the Enlightenment, a period of great intellectual and scientific progress. But we must also remember the price that was paid. The Reformation was a time of great suffering, a time when the light of reason and progress was often extinguished by the flames of intolerance and violence. The stories of those who lived and died in this era serve as a powerful reminder of the importance of tolerance, understanding, and the courage to question.